Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be getting into the security aspects of the Model Context Protocol, MCP. Previous episode, we did an introduction, basically helping to figure that out. And with me to dig into the security aspects of MCP are members of our analyst team, Scott Crawford and Justin Lam. Welcome back to the podcast, you both.
Thanks, Eric. Always a pleasure to join you for Next in Tech.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
If we think about what's happening with MCP, granted, we're running headlong into implementations. There's a lot of active work that's being done on the spec right now in terms of the definitions for what it's all about. There are a whole bunch of changes, but I wanted to start off really thinking about what the security, the different concerns are. How should we be thinking about MCP and whether or not that's sticking into the threat model? Just really thinking about what MCP is really all about. And Scott, I know that we've been making the joke that the S in MCP stands for security.
That's right.
And we're in that same crazy kind of state, I think, that we've been in a lot of different aspects of this strong shift in AI, which is, hey, people are getting out there, putting it to work, and then trying to think about what are the large ramifications.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that we should be thinking about and a lot of different ways in which we can start thinking about it. But I guess maybe let's start with just sort of an overview about some of the concerns and what we've been thinking about as a team.
Yeah, it's not the first time that we've been down this road in tech, as we all know on this session here. There's a need is seen for more than we currently have to make an emerging technology or idea function with greater sophistication, greater utility than its early implementations. What I mean by that in the case of, let's say, agentic AI in particular, is that we see a role to be played for AI technology that can operate with a fair degree of autonomy, that can use tools that can emulate human reasoning or model it, might be a better way to put it, up to a point, given the current state of the technology, and take actions. And it's anticipated we'll do so with a fair degree of autonomy. The gotchas we see so far is that that's a great idea and is working insofar as we see so far relatively straightforward deployments, quite often fairly simple workflows, individual agents being deployed to assist with tasks and workflows and so on. But when we talk about things that are more complex workflows, more agents involved in multiple steps, then we're talking more about agentic AI than just agents per se or agents in isolation. For that, we need a structure to support that evolution. And MCP is one of the first efforts at devising a specification for weaving those components together in a more systematic, structured, coherent manner. That's the idea at this point. I mean, MCP makes it possible to share between modules, if you will, of functionality in an agentic architecture, things like instructions, prompts, memory references, potentially task progress and state, share those across agents in an environment or components in an AI functional environment, agentic AI environment, and do so in a structured way. So it makes the whole work together better in principle, makes it possible to devise more complex architectures or workflows for agentic AI. But it does imply a few things. It implies, first of all, a fair degree of trust in this control architecture, if you will, that we're already seeing in MCP deployments. So the question that raises for security is that trust merited? I mean, we spend a lot of cycles in our world talking about zero trust and trust but verify, but there's some implicit trust in the deployments of MCP we've seen so far already. Is that justified? So some of the things that we have to consider, first of all, is authentication authorization for MCP hosts, servers, endpoints themselves, clients themselves. Are they who we expect them to be? Can we validate their identity in a given environment? And then some of the things that we've had as issues with the security previously of generative AI, such as things like prompt injection. Can we inject malicious prompts into workflows in which MCP becomes involved? Supply chain risks with the software itself. The deployment of a rogue MCP server that appears to be doing legitimate functionality, but in fact is not what it represents to be. So validation of that. Unauthorized command execution. Oftentimes, this functionality can pass commands from one point to another within a complex workflow. But are those commands that should be executed, or could they be used to execute malicious commands? The data that's exposed in these transactions, sampling of MCP transactions, for one thing. So a lot of issues that we've seen around generative AI functionality, the security of generative AI up to this point, we now apply those to MCP, and we take that a step farther because of the trust implied in this control architecture on which we're building these architectural approaches to agentic AI.
So when we start thinking about it, I guess what I take from your comments is that, one, we should be thinking more about trust, but I guess maybe what we need to do is maybe take a step back and think about what we're actually trying to accomplish on the agentic side, and think about some of how we structure this. And Justin, we've been talking about some of the ways in which we expect these things to move forward. But I guess fundamentally, maybe we should be thinking about what we're trying to achieve as part of this whole process to begin with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we can talk about the risks of, I mean, just with any sort of technology, you can talk about the risks of doing something, but you have to look at the reasons why. Thinking about the rewards why. I think that just is absolutely essential given how fast this environment is moving, kind of the sizes of the bets that people are making to try and experiment and try and put this into production.
I guess some of those pieces start to shake out around, as a result, what actions do we think are going to be undertaken by agents? And I guess one of the things that I keep stumbling over in a number of the conversations that I've had around this are this shift that's required in what we think we need for some level of identity and access management around agents. And even as we were coming through the RSA conference, the conversation seemed to be changing, moving from, oh, well, agents need to be treated like people, and you need to have the same kind of complex identity capabilities that you have for people, to really, by the end of the week,
Yeah,
those that have been thinking more about it realizing, oh, no, this is very different than people. This is something we've got to think about in very different ways. And it's not just the identity piece. And again, one of the things that one of the reasons I bring it up is there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the initial authentication mechanism with MCP were really simple. It was OAuth and relatively basic. And when we think about the kinds of things that we're expecting agents to do, there's a lot more that has to happen because agents are, in fact, going to be acting in very different ways and doing very different things.
you're right. There's absolutely, I mean, with just general AI, generative AI in general, the threat model is entirely different, right? And so you've got, sure, there's this loss of data that occurs, and you see a lot of security for Gen AI solutions looking at sort of the initial DLP use case where I don't want to have anything that I communicate through prompts, whether that's through my client to an MCP server. I don't want it to be training data, or I don't want to be exposed to anything that might be retrieved inappropriately. You see a lot of initial focus on that. But I think that when you look at what these agents can do and what threats that they can impose, it's not just a matter of, hey, am I authenticating a workload based upon whether or not it can lose data or whether it can expose data, but can it tamper with it? Can it actually make a distrustful sort of experience? And then can that be used in an adversarial kind of way? It is now a very different risk calculation that I think is really hard to sort of quantify, because this whole idea of trustworthiness in an agentic workflow is this really, what is the harm that could come if I am using Cursor for my code development? And yes, it creates for me code that compiles, but let's say it also has, a vulnerability or a flaw within it itself. How do I quantify that risk? And so there's a very different sort of model that's coming around, and it's really around this point of, sort of data integrity more so than, just sort of data confidentiality. And I think that's the thing that, when you're looking behind some of the identity access management and you're looking at what are the harms, it's not just the loss of data, though that is important. It's also, what are the mistrust, what are the abuses that can happen?
And if we think about moving on from the data loss prevention piece, I mean, this has been, as you're pointing out, this has been that big conversation up front about, I don't want to expose data. All right, now we're going to start putting in place capabilities to make sure that there aren't malicious prompts, and so that that the requests wind up being validated in some meaningful way. But we start getting right back into that question of, what does that whole environment look like? And as you're pointing out, if we've got agents that are going to be pulling data and generating outcomes based on that data, now we need to be to a point at which we can imbue some level of trust into that process of, hey, what are they going to do with it? What are those secondary products from that data actually going to look like? And that's a really complicated problem to start to solve.
It absolutely is. I mean, there's always this argument that, hey, there should be a human in the loop, and rightly so. But at some point in time, that goes against the sort of whole economic argument of generative AI in the first place, right? The whole idea behind all this automation is so that I don't have to manually intervene. And I think that when you think about some of the defenses used against these kinds of abuses or harms, the next question is, well, can I use automation? And you see what's going to happen is this, what's already beginning to happen is sort of this cat and mouse game between, hey, I've got AI that could be, potentially untrusted. Well, let me use AI to build trust into trusting this untrusted AI. And so now, behind the scenes, any sort of security, any kind of intervention going on within Gen AI, if it is in fact itself Gen AI powered, then you've got the capabilities of detection racing against, the adversarial sorts of challenges, and that's a tricky thing to manage in the long run.
And that kind of hegemony is where we've always existed in security, right?
Right, right.
Battling the attackers and ensuring that we're at least not too far behind where the attacker community happens to be.
It's a constant thing in our space. I mean, security is a space, not to digress from the topic at hand here, but, so many other aspects of technology, it's maybe simplistic to say it's a little more straightforward for them. They have their competition and they have defined objectives that they're working toward in a market. Well, we have that in security as well, but we also have the fact that the goalposts are constantly being moved by the adversary, and then vice versa. The defenders are moving the goalposts as well. It keeps shifting. It's a lot more like military strategy than it is other aspects of a market, and that's one of the big challenges here. It's kind of encouraging that we have MCP coming forward and similar sort of approaches like agent-to-agent protocol, which we saw Google talking about at Google Cloud Next this past spring. We got to start somewhere. Similarly for OpenAI, the fact that not OpenAI, similar to OAuth, the fact that the functionality was packaged, very relatively simplistically with an MCP server or host. Now we're talking about, okay, let's make this a little more enterprise ready. Let's separate out, like the identity provider where there might be an existing enterprise deployment. That we don't have to build this all from scratch just for the sake of getting an MCP architecture rolling. So it's stepwise maturity. These initial implementations have to happen before we see further elaboration of where they're going to go. But they do have to move in that more, Justin, as you put it, more trustworthy direction. And I don't think that's a misused terminology, even though we talk about zero trust a lot, or trust but verify. Confidence may be another way to think about it. A deployment where we can have greater confidence that this functionality is doing what we want it to do and what it's purported to do, to be doing. We will get there, but this is the time to make those steps. We've already seen, Apple researchers talk about some of the things that still need to be accomplished to make agentic architectures more reliable. Certainly saw Carnegie Mellon looking at an agentic business, and it didn't fare very well in their lab example. So this is the time. This is the really good time to be paying attention to these things. And yeah, we'll be seeing a lot of activity in that this year.
So where do we start headed? Where do we start heading in terms of what things we should put in place? I think one of the challenges that always exists, this is not a movement that you can stop. This is, organizations are pushing forward to be able to leverage the competitive advantages of AI, and to, I think, an even greater degree than often exists. These are projects that are moving forward and trying to, stand in front of the moving train is a bad idea.
Right.
And realistically, we also should be in a position where we, as security professionals, should be helping businesses use these capabilities and put them to work, so that we're not just the Department of No, that we're actually pushing this forward in ways that are at least going to be sustainable longer term. How do we start to go about that? What are the things that organizations should be aware of when they're putting MCP to work? And how do we actually start to make some sense in terms of how these implementations are working and what we should really be looking for?
I think, one of the distinctions I make in my mind is, what are the current processes you want to improve versus what are the new processes that you want to actually achieve? I think when I think about current processes in an enterprise, the current tactics, summarizing my email, summarizing the content, the contents of this conversation, that's sort of has a known outcome for the most part. And it can be measured in what was the amount of toil it took to accomplish that procedure. And is that going to be my metric for lowering that? I think from a threat modeling perspective, from a security perspective, the goal in mind for the users is pretty much well defined. I think when you start talking about more advanced things, where I want to use generative AI in general, to have or achieve or do new processes, do new services. I mean, that's what does that outcome actually look like? I think that's going to be a little bit trickier to certainly understand the security risks associated with that. That's going to take more work together with other stakeholders.
Well, you point out what is one of the most important conversations I think that we keep identifying around AI broadly is know your use case.
Yeah.
And when you've got the ability to take an existing process, you at least have an understanding of what that process looks like, what are its current bounds, and you can know what you know what the process does today, you know what the risks are associated with it today, and you can start to implement it. Whereas if you pick something that is truly amazing and wonderful and nobody's done before, a little riskier in terms of what what it could do, and understanding what the various outcomes could be, because you've never done it before.
Right.
AI for security is actually a really stellar use case, which obviously we see every day because we get hammered with this stuff. However many thousands of vendors in the security landscape there are, there's quite a few that have an idea about applying AI to security. But there's a huge need. I mean, security teams are overwhelmed with data. Response is equally overwhelming because of the tasks that have to be done. So there's already some visionary thinking about where it could go. We've been talking about the autonomous SOC in one form or another for years. Well, now we kind of see that this could be maybe not so far out on the horizon, as far as, going through all the telemetry that we have for threat detection, correlating that with the telemetry we have on exposures. Is there an active threat? Is it targeting these exposures? Do we actually have these exposures? putting that together and prioritizing response and then automating response in a way that doesn't kill the business in the process of mitigating risk, all that sounds wonderful and achievable, but that's also some very complex workflows and probably a lot of individual modules, for lack of a better word, or agents if you prefer, that have to be put together in an architectural approach to making a whole greater than some of the parts. That's a very aspirational vision. And right now, we're trying to get the individual pieces to work together in concert and facing challenges there. So, yeah, we have to start with what's known. Justin's exactly right. And where we know we can measure productivity and measure benefit, start there and build from there. Once we have known success, then we can start maybe trusting these architectures more to say, hey, this might be a better way to do this. Would you like me to try to put together a workflow that would do this better than I'm currently doing it for you now in an autonomous fashion? That's an awful lot of trust to place in technology. And we got a ways to go.
Is this problem any different than what we've faced in automation in general? Because this is one of the things that we've always, one of the stumbling blocks we've always had in automation is when do you get to a point at which you turn, whether or not that happens to be, scripted environments, ML capabilities we've had for ages and ages. Everybody always gets concerned about how you get to a point at which you trust it enough to let it do the thing by itself. And a little generative AI pixie dust sort of sprinkled on top of a lot of these paths doesn't necessarily suddenly make it all that much more trustable. So
Makes it sparkly, though.
Eric, I think it goes back to the users. I think it goes back to what does that actual user experience look like? Along the lines of identity and access management. For automation. We just published a spotlight report on non-human identities, and the trick with all of that, what's really, sure, there's been a lot more non-human identities for IoT, for various workloads in the cloud and whatnot, but it's the insertion of that identity and access management into whatever is provisioning that, the factory floor where all that stuff is being made and built. That's the key, is that you've got to make these ingredients of security easy to blend in. I think that, if I look at some of the legacy of, PKI and provisioning individual certs and that kind of pain, that's very difficult to do if it's not friendly and easy to use. And I think that with this explosion of MCP, A to A, whatever that might look like, it's got to be easy to factor in those elements so that if I don't explicitly trust it, at least I can have the mechanism or the wherewithal to be able to build trust in it quickly.
So maybe the Gen AI advantage is that, while it may not be able to explain it in great detail, it can at least give you more context around what's happening. It can give you a natural language explanation for what it thinks is happening. I guess maybe we're moving from sort of the clippy assistant model of, it looks like you're trying to fix a vulnerability, to, maybe something that's a little more 2001 and sort of like, Dave, I can fix that vulnerability for you. And, but it's still, the bottom line still is getting to that level of trust and being able to get to a point, and I guess maybe the thing that we're heading towards is that generative approaches ought to be able to imbue an agent with the ability to at least explain where it's going, to help build some of that trust. I don't know. Is that roughly where we're going? Or have we gotten that far from clipping?
I think just making it easier, like along this progression, there's going to have to be some human in the loop. Making it easier for that human, and again, providing that human context for why are you intervening at this process to make it easier. When I see like the meeting summary from, any of these calls, can I glance at it and say, yeah, that's what happened. Great. And then I just move on, right? You make it easy for the user to be able to insert themselves, make that human in the loop easy and not so much an interruption to what they're trying to do.
So what you're pointing out is that the value of AI is you take the human out of the loop, but I guess we're just not there yet.
I think of that as the sliding window theory of human in the loop. And what I mean by that is for things that we don't have a lot of confidence yet in automation to perform without a high degree of supervision, then yes, people will need to be involved. But ultimately, we cannot keep people in the loop. Both of you have made this point. That is the point of what we're trying to do.
Right.
As we invest more confidence in those automated workflows, then people can start coming out of the loop. And indeed, I would expect agentic functionality or generative functionality to point that out and say, hey, you've made the same decision on this process several times now. Do you want me to just do it for you? And there's a point where you could say, yeah, we could trust the automation, let it do it for you. But on the bleeding edge of that, where it hasn't proven itself yet, yeah, there's still going to probably always be some room for people to be involved. But as the maturity progresses or the familiarity progresses, people will have to necessarily start coming out of those loops, or the value of what we're trying to achieve will just, it simply won't be there.
Well, I guess this is a discussion that is clearly going to be going on for some time. But I want to thank you both for digging into a lot of the details here, but I guess clearly a lot more to resolve, but more episodes to deal with this as we move forward. But thanks to you both. This has been a great discussion.
We wouldn't have it any other way.
No, we live for this kind of thing. Thank you, Eric. It's always fun.
Well, unfortunately, we are at time for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Faran Miadoshin, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Hope you'll join us for our next episode, because there is always something next in tech.